HOA paved over my creek. So I let their basements slowly fill with groundwater. What happens when an HOA paves over a creek and groundwater begins filling their basements? And how could covering one creek lead to a problem that keeps getting worse? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. It is great to have you here for another story. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you for watching, supporting, and continuing to spend your time with us. Your support means a lot and helps keep these stories coming. Before we start, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let's get into the story. Whatever you did to that creek, undo it before another basement gets wet. Claire Harrington stood halfway down the basement stairs with one hand wrapped around the railing and the other pointing at me like I had personally invited the groundwater inside. The sump pump beside my boots kicked on again with a hard mechanical hum, sending another surge of cloudy water through a discharge hose toward the backyard. I looked down at the concrete floor. A dark, damp line traced the bottom of the foundation wall, and tiny beads of moisture glittered beneath the utility light. The air smelled like wet concrete, cardboard, and that cold mineral scent you get when water has been sitting where it does not belong. I did not change the creek, I said. Claire's jaw tightened. Then explain this. She swept her hand across the basement. Behind her stood Daniel Foster, the homeowner, wearing rubber boots over his jeans. 3 months earlier, Daniel had never needed those boots inside his own house. Now his sump pump had been running almost continuously for 48 hours. This was not the only one. For houses along the western edge of Brookstone Ridge had reported groundwater problems that week. 2 more homeowners had called that morning. Claire wanted one explanation, and she wanted my name attached to it. I crouched beside the foundation wall and pressed my moisture meter against the concrete. The reading climbed. How long has the pump been cycling like this? I asked Daniel. Since Tuesday night. Maybe every 4 minutes at first. Now it barely stops. Claire folded her arms. Which started after Mercer refused to cooperate with our drainage improvements. My name is Ryan Mercer. I was 44 years old, and I had spent 22 years digging foundations, grading lots, installing culverts, and fixing drainage mistakes made by people who thought water could be negotiated with. My family owned 38 acres directly west of Brookstone Ridge, and Mill Creek crossed the lower edge of my property before continuing toward the subdivision. Or at least it used to continue naturally. I slipped the moisture meter back into my jacket and walked upstairs. Claire followed me through Daniel's kitchen and out into the gray March morning. The neighborhood looked perfect from the street. Trim lawns, matching mailboxes, stone entrance signs, bare maple trees waiting for spring. But along the curb, discharge hoses snaked from several houses, spilling clear water into the gutter. You could hear some pumps cycling through open basement vents like distant washing machines. Claire pointed west. The creek is on your land. This is your responsibility. I looked past the houses toward the smooth black strip of asphalt behind them. For months earlier, that pavement had not existed. There had been grass, cattails, a shallow drainage swale, and Mill Creek moving through an old corrugated culvert before continuing downhill. Then Brookstone Ridge decided the area looked unfinished. They paved it. Straight lines, fresh curbs, decorative lighting, clean landscaping. Beautiful work, if you ignored what had been underneath it. I walked toward the new access road while Claire followed several steps behind. Near the curb, I stopped and looked at a storm drain. Water sat almost motionless beneath the grate. That was wrong. I could smell saturated soil even through the cold air. Claire came beside me. Well, I looked at the asphalt, then toward the row of houses with their sump hoses running. You keep asking what I did. She waited. I pointed beneath our feet. I did not change Mill Creek, Claire. You did. For months earlier, before the pumps, before the wet basement walls, before homeowners started asking where their association dues had gone, I had warned her about this exact piece of ground. She had smiled at me and called Mill Creek a ditch. My father had another name for places like this. He called them roads for water. And he taught me one rule I never forgot. Water remembers the lowest road. 4 months earlier, Mill Creek looked exactly the way it had for most of my life. It was not impressive enough for postcards. At its widest point on my property, you could cross it in 6 long steps during a dry week. Cottonwoods leaned over the banks, cattails grew around the slower bends, and an old corrugated steel culvert carried the water beneath a gravel service lane near the eastern boundary. My grandfather had bought the 38 acres in 1969. My father inherited it, and I grew up learning the property one fence post at a time. Dad operated excavation equipment for 35 years. He could look across a field after a storm and tell you where water would collect before the first puddle appeared. When I started working with him as a teenager, he taught me to read land the same way. Grade, soil, vegetation, drainage. Water remembers the lowest road. He would say whenever a customer wanted to force runoff somewhere, it did not naturally belong. You can slow it down. You can guide it. But you better give it somewhere to go. I eventually built my own excavation and drainage business, and those 38 acres became both my home and the place where I stored equipment between jobs. Brookstone Ridge came later. The first houses went up about 15 years ago on former pasture east of my property. The developers installed storm drains, retention areas, foundation drains, and a network of underground pipes designed around the existing terrain. Mill Creek was part of that terrain. Nobody called it beautiful back then. They called it drainage. That changed when Claire Harrington became association president. Claire liked clean lines, matching stonework, decorative lighting. Everything in Brookstone Ridge had to look intentional. She was 53, always perfectly dressed, always carrying a leather folder, and somehow capable of making a conversation about weeds sound like a corporate merger. The first time she approached me about the creek corridor was in late October. I was greasing the fittings on my compact excavator when her white sport utility vehicle rolled into my gravel drive. She stepped out wearing polished boots that immediately collected dust. Mr. Mercer, Brookstone Ridge is considering improvements along the rear access corridor. She unfolded a glossy site rendering across the hood of my truck. The drawing showed a smooth asphalt road lined with ornamental grasses and low stone lights. I studied it for maybe 10 seconds before noticing what was missing. Where is Mill Creek? Claire tapped a narrow blue line disappearing beneath the proposed pavement. It will be contained properly. Contained how? A culvert system. Our consultant says the current area is inefficient and unattractive. I looked toward the eastern boundary. Yellow leaves floated along the creek, collecting briefly against the old culvert before slipping through. That low ground is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Claire smiled. It is a ditch, Mr. Mercer, not a river. I wiped grease from my fingers with a shop rag. Then why are you spending $60,000 trying to control it? Her smile disappeared for half a second. She explained that residents wanted safer maintenance access and cleaner landscaping. I told her any design needed to preserve the existing drainage capacity and respect my property boundary. Then I walked her to the creek. I showed her the old culvert, the survey stake beside the cottonwood, and the shallow swale spreading east toward Brookstone Ridge. The soil was still damp from rain 3 days earlier. This whole strip moves water, I said. Not just the channel. Claire glanced at her boots, then back toward her vehicle. Our engineers understand drainage. Good, I said. Then they will understand why this matters. She left without another word. I thought the conversation had been a warning. Claire apparently heard it as permission to prove me wrong. 3 weeks later, I smelled the asphalt before I saw it. Hot tar has a sharp, oily bite that hangs in cold air, and that morning it reached my porch before the first dump truck came into view. I had spent the day inspecting a drainage job 20 miles south and returned just before 4 in the afternoon. When I rounded the eastern fence line, the ground seemed to hum beneath my boots. A roller was moving slowly across a strip of fresh black pavement where grass and cattails had been the week before. Mill Creek was gone beneath it. I stood there for a second, listening to diesel engines idle and gravel crunch beneath truck tires. Then I noticed the old corrugated culvert stacked beside a dumpster. In its place, the contractor had installed a new pipe that looked smaller. Much smaller. I walked toward the cottonwood where my survey marker should have been. The steel pin was still underground, but the orange witness stake beside it had disappeared beneath freshly graded soil. One of the workers recognized me and called the foreman. He approached carrying rolled plans under one arm. You Ryan Mercer? That depends on why there is asphalt over the drainage corridor. He unfolded the plans across the tailgate of his truck. Brookstone Ridge rear access improvement. The road crossed the low ground, enclosed the creek inside a new culvert, and continued along the subdivision boundary. I pointed at the pipe specification. What size is that? 30 inches. I looked toward the removed culvert. The old one was 48. He shrugged. Engineering signed off. For what flow rate? His expression changed. That was when Claire arrived. Her white sport utility vehicle rolled onto the new pavement like she had been waiting for the moment. She stepped out wearing a charcoal coat and that same calm smile. Mr. Mercer, I assume you have seen the improvement. I have seen a smaller pipe where a larger one used to be. The previous culvert was outdated. Outdated does not mean unnecessary. She opened her leather folder and handed me a packet. The first page called the project Drainage Modernization and Community Access Enhancement. The second showed a contractor map. The third nearly made me laugh. Brookstone Ridge was assessing me $2,400 for what it described as shared boundary drainage improvements. You buried part of a creek, disturbed my boundary, and now you want me to pay for it. Claire kept her voice smooth. Your property benefits from improved runoff management. I pointed toward the fresh pavement. That road is sitting on a floodplain swale. Our consultant disagrees. Did your consultant test groundwater elevation? The project was professionally designed. That was not my question. Her smile tightened. Behind us, the roller passed again, pressing another section of asphalt flat. Steam lifted from the surface. Everything looked clean, finished, permanent. That was exactly what worried me. I walked downstream and found the new culvert outlet. Water trickled from the pipe, but the soil around it was almost dry. Upstream was different. The creek had spread wider against the new embankment. Cattails leaned in standing water where the ground had normally drained within hours. I crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. Saturated. Claire stopped several feet behind me. You are looking for a problem because you opposed the project. I stood and wiped mud onto my jeans. No, I am looking at where the water went. She glanced toward the creek. It is going through the pipe. Some of it. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of hot asphalt between us. I took photographs of the culvert, pavement, boundary line, and wet soil. Then I photographed the contractor plans. Claire watched without saying anything. Before leaving, I placed one boot at the edge of the new road and felt the faint vibration of the roller through the ground. Above us, Brookstone Ridge had its clean black pavement. Underneath it, the drainage system had just been given less room to breathe. I gave Claire 48 hours to send me the engineering calculations. She sent me a brochure instead. 6 glossy pages showed the new access road beneath computer-generated trees, decorative stone lights, and smiling residents walking dogs along pavement that had apparently never seen rain. There was no groundwater table, no culvert capacity sheet, no soil report. I called the county public works office that morning and filed a drainage complaint. Then I hired a licensed surveyor named Mark Sullivan to verify the eastern boundary before another truck crossed it. Mark arrived the next day with a tripod, receiver, and the patient expression of a man who trusted coordinates more than people. We spent 3 hours walking the low ground. By noon, he had confirmed something I already suspected. The pavement itself remained mostly inside Brookstone Ridge property, but grading near the culvert had crossed several feet onto mine, disturbing the drainage swale and burying one of the old witness markers. That gave me a property issue. It still did not explain the water, so I attended the next association meeting. Claire sat beneath the Brookstone Ridge seal while about 40 residents filled the clubhouse. I brought photographs of the saturated soil, measurements from the old culvert, and Mark's preliminary boundary notes. Claire brought their consultant, a young engineer named Trevor Blake. Trevor explained that the 30-inch pipe was designed for normal seasonal flow. I asked what rainfall event they had modeled. He gave me a technical answer without giving me a number. I asked whether they had measured the seasonal groundwater elevation before paving the swale. He glanced toward Claire. The project scope focused on surface drainage. There it was. Surface drainage. I leaned back in my chair. Claire smiled as if she had won. Mr. Mercer has opposed this improvement from the beginning, she told the room. The road is complete, permitted, and functioning exactly as intended. Several residents nodded. I could understand why. Outside the clubhouse windows, the new asphalt looked beautiful under the parking lights. Compared with my muddy photographs, Claire's version of progress was easier to sell. I drove home without arguing. 2 days later, a steady rain moved through the county. Nothing severe, just 12 hours of ordinary November weather. The next morning I walked Mill Creek before sunrise. My boots sank deeper than usual near the eastern boundary. The upstream swale held a sheet of standing water. The new culvert was flowing, but not fast enough to clear the low ground. I drove a temporary measuring stake into the soil beside an old monitoring pipe Dad had installed years ago when we were planning an equipment shed. I removed the cap and lowered a weighted tape. The metallic click echoed inside the pipe. Water sat 28 inches below grade. I checked Dad's old notebook in the workshop. Same location, similar season, similar rainfall. His recorded level had been 43 inches below grade, 15 inches higher. One reading did not prove anything. So I stopped complaining and started measuring. Every morning at 6:30, I checked the pipe. I photographed the creek. I recorded rainfall from a gauge beside the barn. I marked how long standing water remained after each storm. A week passed, then another. The asphalt stayed clean and black. Underneath the ground, the numbers kept moving in the wrong direction. Claire sent me an email demanding payment of the $2,400 assessment. I printed it, placed it beside my measurements, and did not respond. By early December, the groundwater was 23 inches below grade, 5 inches higher than my first reading. That afternoon, I opened Dad's old map cabinet looking for more historical measurements. Beneath a stack of equipment plats, I found a folded county drainage plan dated 14 years earlier, when Brookstone Ridge was still under construction. I spread it across the workbench and followed Mill Creek east with my finger. Then I noticed a series of arrows beneath the future houses. They did not point toward a storm drain. They pointed toward the creek. Those arrows changed the question completely. I was no longer asking whether the new culvert could carry Mill Creek after a normal rain. I was asking what happened to the water beneath Brookstone Ridge when the creek corridor could no longer relieve it the way the original development plan expected. The next morning, I called Laura Bennett, a civil engineer I had worked with on 2 commercial drainage projects. She arrived that afternoon with rolled plans, a laser level, and enough skepticism to make me trust her immediately. We spread Dad's old county drainage plan across my workbench beside the current Brookstone Ridge site map. The paper smelled like dust and machine oil. Laura traced the arrows beneath the western row of houses. These are subsurface drainage assumptions, she said. The foundations were designed with groundwater moving toward this low corridor. Her finger stopped at Mill Creek. Then she placed the new road plan over the old map. The asphalt crossed the same corridor. They did not just replace a culvert, I said. Laura nodded. They raised grade, compacted fill, narrowed the surface outlet, and paved over soil that used to accept and release water. She was careful not to jump to conclusions. One old map and my monitoring pipe were not enough. So we built a record. Laura installed 2 temporary groundwater monitoring points on my property with permission from the county. We measured elevations. We photographed soil conditions. We compared rainfall totals with water levels. Mark returned and tied every location to surveyed coordinates. Within 10 days, a pattern appeared. After each ordinary rain, Mill Creek still moved through the 30-inch pipe, but groundwater upstream rose faster and stayed high longer than Dad's historical records showed. The road looked perfect because the problem was underneath it. Laura requested the original Brookstone Ridge development documents from county archives. When they arrived, the answer became harder to ignore. The western homes had basement elevations and foundation drainage designed around the natural low corridor, remaining hydraulically open. Nobody had promised those basements would flood if it changed. Engineering does not work like fortune-telling. But the original design clearly treated Mill Creek and the surrounding swale as part of the site's drainage system. Claire had called it an ugly ditch. The engineers who designed her neighborhood had treated it like infrastructure. I asked Laura to prepare a written warning explaining what we had found. Martin Keller, a property attorney I had used on a boundary dispute years earlier, reviewed it before we sent anything. The letter did not threaten Claire. It did not exaggerate. It simply documented the altered grade, reduced culvert size, rising groundwater measurements, and potential risk to nearby foundations if wet conditions continued. We sent it by certified mail to Claire and every Brookstone Ridge board member. 3 days later, the delivery receipt came back. Claire Harrington had signed for it herself. That afternoon she called me. "Your engineer is trying to frighten our board." I stood beside the monitoring pipe while cold wind moved through the cottonwoods. "She is giving you measurements. The road passed inspection. Then have your engineer review the groundwater data." Claire exhaled sharply. We are not tearing up $60,000 of completed pavement because you found an old map. I looked at the watermark on my measuring tape. 19 inches below grade now. Claire, I am not asking you to believe the map. I am asking you to look at what the ground is doing. The project is finished. I watched Mill Creek squeeze through the smaller culvert and disappear beneath the smooth black road. The asphalt is finished, I said. The water is not. She ended the call. I wrote down the time, clipped her signed delivery receipt to Laura's report, and placed both inside a folder. Outside, clouds were gathering over the western tree line. For the first time, I was not wondering whether Claire understood the warning. I had proof that she had received it. The rain that arrived that night was ordinary enough that nobody paid attention to it. No thunder. No emergency alerts. Just a cold December rain tapping against windows and running steadily from gutters for 6 hours. By sunrise, my gauge showed 0.8 of an inch. I pulled on my boots and walked to the monitoring pipe with a flashlight. The weighted tape touched water at 17 inches below grade, 2 inches higher than 3 days earlier. Mill Creek was moving through the new culvert, but the upstream swale had turned glossy with standing water. I photographed everything, logged the numbers, and sent them to Laura Bennett. Her reply came 20 minutes later. Keep measuring. That became my routine. Rainfall, creek depth, groundwater elevation, photographs, dates, times. I installed a weatherproof camera overlooking my side of the drainage corridor, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because slow problems are easy to deny when nobody records them. Mark Sullivan returned to mark the surveyed boundary with fresh orange stakes. Laura added another monitoring point farther uphill so we could compare elevations. Every piece of information told the same quiet story. The groundwater rose after rain and fell too slowly afterward. Brookstone Ridge still looked normal above ground. Christmas wreaths hung from doors. Decorative lights wrapped the entrance monument. Claire even published a neighborhood newsletter praising the new access road as a successful infrastructure upgrade. I printed that page and placed it in the same folder as her signed warning letter. Then January brought 2 more moderate rain systems. Nothing unusual for the season. After the second one, the monitoring pipe showed 13 inches below grade. Laura called me that afternoon. Ryan, we need their engineer to see this. We sent another notice, this time including charts. Claire replied through the association attorney. Their position had not changed. The road was permitted, the culvert was functioning, and there was no demonstrated damage to association property. That last phrase caught my attention. No demonstrated damage. Not yet. I did not want anyone's house damaged. I wanted them to fix the drainage before that happened. Martin Keller drafted a request for county review, and Laura submitted her measurements with the original development plans. 2 weeks later, a county engineer named Paul Reeves met us at the site. He walked the creek slowly, studying the new pavement, culvert inlet, saturated swale, and elevations around the western houses. Claire arrived halfway through the inspection. This has become excessive, she said. Paul did not argue. He simply asked for the project's groundwater analysis. Claire looked toward Trevor Blake, the association consultant. Trevor opened his folder, flipped through several pages, then said, the scope primarily addressed surface conveyance. Paul looked at him. So there was no groundwater analysis before the fill was compacted? Nobody answered immediately. I could hear water dripping from the culvert outlet behind us. Paul asked for the compaction records, pre-construction grading plan, and original drainage calculations. Claire crossed her arms. The road has been functioning for months. Paul glanced toward the saturated ground. That is what we are evaluating. After they left, Claire walked over to me. You seem determined to make this project fail. I looked at the black pavement stretching behind her. I have not touched your road. You keep filing complaints. Because the water keeps rising. She shook her head and returned to her vehicle. I checked the monitoring pipe again before sunset. 12 inches below grade. I wrote the number in my notebook and stared at it for a moment. Dad's old records had shown more than 40 inches of separation during comparable winter conditions. Above ground, Claire's road still looked flawless. Underneath it, groundwater had climbed nearly 3 feet closer to the surface than the historical benchmark. The next morning, Daniel Foster from Brookstone Ridge called my business number. He sounded embarrassed. Ryan, you work with drainage, right? Every day. He paused. My sump pump turned on last night. I have lived here 11 years. I have never heard it run in December. I looked toward Mill Creek through the workshop window. The creek was still flowing. The road was still perfect. And for the first time, the problem had crossed from my measuring tape into somebody's basement. Daniel's sump pump was the first one I could hear from the sidewalk. By the end of January, there were 3. None of the basements had standing water yet, which gave Claire just enough room to keep calling the situation normal. She sent residents an email explaining that seasonal groundwater fluctuations sometimes caused sump systems to activate during wet winters. That statement might have sounded reasonable if the winter had actually been unusually wet. It had not. Laura pulled rainfall records from the county station and compared them with the previous 10 years. We were sitting almost exactly on the seasonal average. I added that report to the folder. Every time Claire tried to make the problem smaller, the paperwork made the pattern clearer. Daniel let Laura and me inspect his basement. His foundation walls were dry, but the sump pit was filling fast enough to trigger the pump every 11 minutes. At the next house, the pump cycled every 18. A third homeowner named Rebecca Collins showed us a dark line along the bottom of her concrete wall that disappeared when the weather stayed dry and returned after rain. Laura photographed it, measured moisture, and wrote down the basement floor elevation. Then she compared those elevations with the old Brookstone Ridge development plan. The western row of basements sat exactly where the original engineers had expected groundwater to drain toward the Mill Creek corridor. This is becoming consistent, she told me. Not proof of every individual moisture issue, but consistent. That distinction mattered. I was not interested in exaggerating. I wanted numbers Claire could not dismiss. February gave us more. 1 inch of rain over 2 days. Nothing dramatic. The monitoring pipe rose to 9 inches below grade. Daniel's pump ran almost continuously overnight. Rebecca found moisture around her floor drain. 2 houses farther south reported the same thing. I drove the neighborhood early the next morning and counted 5 discharge hoses stretched across lawns toward the curb. The air carried the damp smell of thawing soil. Water trickled along the gutter while Claire's new access road sat behind the houses, smooth and black, without a puddle on it. That was the irony. The pavement looked like the driest place in Brookstone Ridge because the water was finding somewhere else to go. Paul Reeves returned with another county inspector. This time they opened the culvert inlet, checked elevations, reviewed compaction records, and compared Trevor Blake's design with the original drainage plan. Claire arrived before they finished. "Are we seriously doing this again?" she asked. Paul held up a copy of Laura's groundwater chart. "The conditions changed after construction. We need to understand why." Claire turned toward me. "You have been feeding them numbers for months." "Measurements," I said. "There is a difference." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "What exactly do you want?" "Restore the drainage capacity before homeowners pay for the mistake. The board is not tearing up that road. Then have your engineer prove it is not contributing to the groundwater rise." She looked toward Trevor. He said nothing. That silence lasted longer than it should have. A week later, Martin obtained the final project file through the county. Buried near the back was an early consultant note recommending additional subsurface review if compacted fill extended across the low drainage corridor. The note had never appeared in the glossy presentation Claire showed residents. Laura read it twice. They were told to study this. I checked the approval date. Claire had signed the construction authorization 11 days later. The same woman who now called the groundwater unpredictable had approved the project after a consultant flagged the exact area for further review. I placed that document beside her certified delivery receipt. Warning before construction. Warning after construction. Her signature appeared on both sides of the timeline. Then March arrived with another ordinary rain, and Daniel called me before sunrise. His voice sounded tired. "Ryan, there is water on the basement floor now." I grabbed my boots and moisture meter. When I reached Brookstone Ridge, Claire's white sport utility vehicle was already parked in his driveway. Claire was standing at the bottom of Daniel's basement stairs when I arrived, staring at a thin sheet of water shining beneath the utility lights. It was not a flood. That was what made it worse. There was no dramatic burst pipe to blame, no storm water pouring through a window, no single broken fitting anyone could replace. The water had simply appeared where the concrete floor met the foundation wall, spreading slowly toward the sump pit, while the pump ran almost without stopping. "Whatever you did to that creek, undo it before another basement gets wet," Claire said. There it was, The same accusation I had known was coming. I set my equipment case on the floor and looked at Daniel. How long? Started around 3 this morning. I checked the wall with my moisture meter, then measured the sump pit. Laura arrived 20 minutes later and took groundwater readings outside. The numbers matched the pattern we had documented for months. Nothing on my property had changed. No new excavation. No blocked channel. No altered grade. Mill Creek was flowing through the same section I had been photographing since November. The variable was still Claire's Road. By noon, 2 more homeowners reported damp basement walls. The next day, Rebecca Collins found water around her floor drain again. By Friday, 8 houses along the western row had sump pumps cycling far more often than their owners remembered. Claire called an emergency board meeting. This time, residents did not arrive to admire glossy renderings. They carried photographs, pump receipts, moisture reports, and questions. Claire opened by blaming unusual groundwater conditions. Laura quietly placed county rainfall records on the table. Seasonal average. Claire suggested my property might be restricting flow. Mark Sullivan unfolded the boundary survey. No alteration. Trevor Blake said the culvert was still carrying surface water. Paul Reeves answered that nobody disputed that. The concern is whether the reconstructed corridor reduced the site's ability to relieve subsurface water. The room went silent. I opened my folder. First came Dad's old drainage plan showing the original groundwater assumptions. Then the photographs from before construction. Then the 30-inch culvert specification beside the old 48-inch measurement. Then Laura's monitoring charts. 43 inches below grade in Dad's historical notes. 28 inches after construction. 19, 13, 9. Then came the consultant note recommending additional subsurface review before compacted fill crossed the drainage corridor. Finally, Martin placed Claire's signed certified receipt beside the warning we had sent months earlier. She stared at her signature. This did not predict basement flooding, she said. No, Laura replied calmly. It warned that groundwater behavior had changed and recommended investigation. Robert Jenkins, one of the board members, leaned forward. And what did we do after receiving that warning? Claire looked toward Trevor. Trevor looked down at his papers. Nobody answered. That was when Daniel spoke from the back of the room. My basement was dry for 11 years. Rebecca followed. Mine too. Then another homeowner raised a hand. Then another. Claire's version of the story was losing ground one address at a time. She turned toward me. So what do you expect us to do, Ryan? Tear up the entire road. I expect you to fix what the engineering says needs fixing. And until then, I looked around at the residents who had spent months being told the problem was seasonal, unpredictable, or somehow connected to me. Until then, I keep my creek exactly as it is. I am not changing my property to compensate for a drainage problem your board created. Claire's face tightened. So you are just going to let this happen? I closed the folder. I warned you before the first basement got wet. Outside, rainwater moved along the curb beneath the clubhouse lights. Beneath the new asphalt, groundwater was doing what my father had always said it would do. It was finding the lowest road available. And now the people living above it finally knew who had closed the old one. 3 days after that meeting, Paul Reeves sent the county determination. I read it twice at my kitchen table while rain ticked softly against the window. The reconstructed corridor had reduced drainage capacity beyond what the original Brookstone Ridge development plan anticipated, and the association was required to submit corrective engineering before any additional work could be approved. More importantly, the county directed the association to restore adequate conveyance through the low corridor and address the compacted fill affecting subsurface drainage. Claire could no longer call it my theory. The county had put it on letterhead. Brookstone Ridge scheduled another emergency meeting, and this one lasted less than an hour. Robert Jenkins presented the project records. The board had spent more than $60,000 on the access road, yet the early consultant note recommending subsurface review had never been followed by a groundwater study. Claire insisted the contractor should have caught the problem. The contractor produced the signed scope showing he had built exactly what the association approved. She blamed Trevor. Trevor reminded the board that his original scope covered surface conveyance. Then Martin placed Claire's signed authorization beside the consultant warning. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The paper trail was louder than any argument. The board voted to remove Claire as president and appointed Robert interim chair, while an independent financial and engineering review moved forward. 2 weeks later, equipment returned to the access road. This time I watched from my side of the boundary with Laura and Mark. The smell of cut asphalt drifted through the cool morning air. Crews opened the section above the drainage corridor, removed compacted material where required, installed a larger engineered crossing, and restored the swale according to the county-approved plan. Nobody was destroying a road for revenge. They were correcting a system that should have been studied before it was paved. After the first moderate April rain, I walked to Dad's monitoring pipe before sunrise. The weighted tape dropped farther than it had in months, 24 inches below grade. 3 days later, 29. The standing water upstream disappeared faster. Mill Creek moved cleanly beneath the new crossing, carrying a steady brown ribbon of rainwater eastward. Daniel called me the following week. His sump pump had barely run after the latest storm. Rebecca said the damp line along her basement wall was drying. The association eventually reimbursed my survey and legal expenses and canceled the $2,400 assessment they had tried to charge me for the original project. Claire stopped driving past my gate. The last time I saw her, she was leaving the clubhouse carrying the same leather folder she had brought to my property months earlier. She looked toward me but did not stop. I did not need her apology. I had something better. The survey stakes were back where they belonged. The drainage corridor was functioning again, and the homeowners finally understood what had happened beneath their neighborhood. One evening after a spring shower, I took Dad's old drainage map down to Mill Creek. The paper had softened along the folds from years of use. I stood beside the cottonwood where Claire had once looked at the water and called it a ditch. The new culvert murmured beneath the road. No pumps roaring in the distance. No standing water shining across the swale. Just gravity doing ordinary work. Claire had believed asphalt could turn inconvenient ground into useful ground simply because a board approved the invoice. She had mistaken a clean surface for a solved problem. Dad never made that mistake. He knew roads could be paved, pipes could be replaced, and maps could be ignored, but water kept its own memory. I folded his map, slipped it under my arm, and watched Mill Creek disappear beneath the road exactly where it was supposed to. Water remembers the lowest road. Eventually, paperwork remembers who closed it.